So welcome everyone to this Lunch and Learn. It's an information session on the TNFD. I'm Helen Avery, Director of Nature Programmes at the Green Finance Institute. As you may know, we host the Secretariat to the TNFD and also convene the UK National Consultation Group, which I'll be sharing a bit more about later. But just as people are joining and to give them a bit of time, as we're really just top of the hour, we wanted to share a poll just to sort of gauge where you are today in terms of engaging with the TNFD. So I'll just leave this up as people come in. The question is, how would you describe your organisation's engagement with the TNFD framework? This could be your first engagement, you're familiar with the framework, but have not begun planning for disclosures, I suspect. No one's quite there yet. My organisation is planning to disclose via the TNFD, but has not yet incorporated TNFD considerations into your operational decisions, or you've already incorporated TNFD considerations into your decisions. I'll just leave that up for a moment while we allow a few others to join. Okay, I think we'll just close the poll if we can. And here are the results. So it's your first engagement with the TNFD framework, or familiar with the framework, but has not begun planning for disclosures. Seems to be the majority where we are today, which is sort of in line with what we would be expecting. So thank you for taking part. We've got a couple of people who have already engaged in it. We'll be coming to you. I wonder if they're our panelists. If not, would love to hear from you a bit later. So thank you. For those who didn't hear my spiel at the beginning, I'm Helen Avery with the Green Finance Institute, and we host the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures Secretariat with support from the UN, and we convene the UK National Consultation Group. And I'll tell you a bit more about what that is later. Essentially, we're here to really try and engage as many UK corporates as possible with the TNFD development process. That framework is being developed, and I'll talk through that in a moment. And it's going to be launching in September, and we're keen to have as many UK corporates as possible feed back into that design process. It's an open innovation process that the TNFD is conducting. So we're hosting a series of sessions aimed at different sectors, and that work is supported, we're very lucky to have them, by KPMG. And this session is obviously designed just as a lunchtime learning, really to provide information to the energy and extractive sector in the UK about the TNFD. And then I'm going to be joined later by Mark Johnston, Strategy Lead for Nature-Based Solutions at BP. He's also founder and director of the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum. And also be joined by Katie Shaw-Brown, who's Principal Biodiversity Advisor at Rio Tinto, who's joining us from Perth in her evening, who's going to be, and they're both going to be sharing about their experience looking at nature-related risk and how they're engaging with the TNFD, including hopefully some tips on where to start. And we appreciate that nearly everyone, as we saw from our poll, is really at the beginning of this journey, our panelists included, and it's very kind of them to come and share, and we'll have time for a Q&A afterwards where you can pose your questions, not just to Mark and Katie, but also to myself and to KPMG about the TNFD. But before we invite Mark and Katie to join us, we wanted to give you a bit of background on the TNFD and the framework development so far. We were hoping to be joined by Andrew Mitchell, who's one of the co-founders, shall we say, of TNFD. I'm not sure he's there. I can see him, so he's been able to join. So just welcome, Andrew. Andrew is also vice chair of the stewardship group of the TNFD. So we've asked him if he would share some inspirational words with us. If you don't know, the TNFD really is the brainchild of Andrew, although he may not admit it. And he refers to himself as co-founder, but it really wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Andrew. So we're really delighted he was able to join us today just to sort of remind us of the goal. So thanks, Andrew. Over to you.
Well, hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you, and thank you all for joining. You know, nature-related risk is, it's picked up a lot in the last few years, but not everybody really gets it as to what it is. And I think the first thing I really want to say at the beginning is that if you think this is all just about bees and pollination, then you need to get that out of your head. What we're talking about here is not butterflies and bees as nature-related risk, nor are we really talking about farming and agriculture. We're talking about infrastructure that keeps the earth safe. This is very, very large kind of eco-utilities like forests, oceans, landscapes that underpin our global economy in a very, very fundamental and powerful way. And you will have seen numerous reports coming out over the last few years or so, explaining the extent to which the economy is moderately or highly dependent on services from nature. And the World Economic Forum suggested it was around about, slightly more than half of global GDP. Others might say that, in fact, it's 100% of our economy, because, of course, if we took away nature, we wouldn't have an economy. Many of you will be coming to terms with climate change. And since the Paris Agreement back in 2015, we saw a commitment by governments to try to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. But at the same time, we saw the launch of something called the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And the importance of these two events is that on the one hand, you had governments agreeing, 200 of them, to actually do something about climate change from a regulatory perspective. And on the other side, you had a kind of guidebook, a pathway through this maze to try and understand, well, what could we actually do as a business, as a company, and crucially, as asset managers, meaning the shareholders in pension funds, banks lending money, the financial sector, in other words, which is financing emissions. What do they do about it? And how do they measure progress? And they need a framework for that. And that is what the TCFD provided, launched by Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg. Well, of course, carbon is only one part of this story. In a sense, it's your first step into the room of taking on board the economic externalities which we live with every day. We live in a world of private profits and public losses. And those public losses, in a sense, are coming back to haunt us. The loss, it might be the way in which our atmosphere is degrading due to emissions. That is a public loss, but is driven by private enterprise. And the same thing is occurring in nature. And this, of course, is not to blame anyone here. What I'm trying to explain is that these are just real costs that are out there that we don't all pay for. So in the case of nature, it's the same kind of thing. There are private profits and public losses. Most obviously, things like if you tear down a rainforest to make a palm oil company and you want to convert the rainforest, the cost of the loss of biodiversity, the carbon storage that the trees provide, the way in which they cool the land surface and create rain, all of those ecosystem services upon which agriculture might depend, for instance, and we all depend on keeping our atmosphere clean of CO2, all those functions are taken away when that forest is converted into, say, a palm oil plantation. And a palm oil plantation does a wonderful thing. It creates palm oil, which is a marvelous vegetable oil, but the costs of that loss are not included in the price of the palm oil that we use, nor does it appear in the share price necessarily of that company. So it looks like a buy to an investor potentially, or a good bet if you're a lender. And so what we have now is that we're beginning to move on from climate, and after climate, nature is next. But we need to be doing it in parallel, not in linear. And that's because nature can't wait. And when I thought about this in lockdown, having thought about it for a number of years, and we were discussing this with many governments and treasury departments, they often would say, well, you know, we're really busy doing climate now. Can't nature wait? And some of you might say the same thing. But the big wake-up call that happened was indeed lockdown itself. This was caused by a tiny speck of nature that you can't even see, that's turned all our lives upside down, that has completely changed our global economy and is costing us trillions of dollars to try and put it right over those last 3 years. That's what we mean by nature-related risk. It can be big, it can be fast, bigger than climate, and it can hit many sectors. This is not butterflies or bees. This is not just agriculture, but it is about the global food system. So I think the opportunity for all of us here is to consider, where's the upside here? The upside is, as with climate, it was the emergence of renewable energy as a fantastic business opportunity. We shall see the same thing occur in nature with the emergence of what I sometimes jokingly call renewable food or regenerative agriculture. So yes, that is about agriculture and the transformation in our global food system. But it affects many, many other areas, and particularly extractives. That is definitely one of the sectors which is front and center in this battle to save nature, because of course mining and the extraction, whether it's open cast or drilling holes under the ground, whether we're extracting things like timber from natural environments or fish from the ocean, this has a huge impact on our natural ecosystems. So what the TNFD is doing is it's pulling all this knowledge together. We have 40 key companies and investors, banks, asset managers, and the big four all working as members. We've got loads of working groups that have been working over the last year, looking at data, at standards, at metrics, and things like that. We have over 900 institutions now in our TNFD forum. It's growing rapidly worldwide as we suck in all the knowledge. We try and create a framework that is going to work. And it's going to be better than anything else that's out there, because today we have nothing really on this. So by September this year, we will have a framework that's going to be published. It will be not perfect, but it will, I think, enormously advance our thinking and be that kind of pathway through the maze as governments begin to tighten up on nature as well as climate. We saw this happen at COP15 with the agreement by governments on the new global biodiversity framework, a commitment to protecting 30% of the Earth by 2030, and that includes oceans, a historic agreement last week on oceans too. You can see the regulatory environment beginning to grapple with this too. The EU stopping the importation of products linked to deforestation, including illegal fishing and illegal forestry in anti-money laundering provisions and regulations. You know, it's all tightening up. So we're going to have to take this seriously, and we need a guidebook like the TNFD to go through it. So today, let's focus on the extractives area, see what your challenges are, see how TNFD can help, and really looking forward to hearing the discussions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's always such a pleasure to see you, and thank you for sharing with us today. So what I thought I'd do is walk you through some slides. There is a lot of information in these slides, and so I'm not going to linger on them because we'll be sharing them with you. And I think sometimes it's more helpful to hear from those actually working on the ground with the TNFD. So, but I thought it'd be helpful just to sort of highlight some of the key parts of TNFD, point you to some helpful data sources, talk about why it's relevant to the energy and extractives industry as well. So I won't linger on this one. As we heard from Andrew, the TNFD launched in 2021. to develop the framework, and that framework will be published in September 23. The goal, just to remind you, is not to develop a standard, but it's actually to develop a framework for reporting. So we can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So just to give you a sense of what's happened between now and what's happening going forward, and between when it was launched and now, we've had now 3 releases called beta releases of the framework, and there's a lot of information on the TNFD website that you can go and read those. I'll highlight some of the key things that have come out of those reports. Version 4 is going to be released on the 28th of March, and then there's a 60-day period, a consultation period that's sort of a final feedback opportunity. So we're really keen for everyone to sort of look at that release when it comes out on the 28th of March. It's going to point out sector-specific guidance, which will be on the energy and extractive industry. It's going to build on relevant aspects of the global biodiversity framework that Andrew mentioned. Specifically, there was Target 15 that included the encouragement of companies to report and disclose on the nature-related impacts and disclosures. It's going to have metrics and scenarios and some updates to the draft disclosure recommendations. And then we'll share at the end what we'll be doing with KPMG between the end of March and the beginning of June to support you if you are looking to feedback into that framework. And then September, it's going to be finalized and the recommendations published. So on the next slide, just to sort of go through some of the key parts of the TNFD, and I say I'm not going to linger on these slides because there's a lot of detail and we'll share it with you. But in response to calls from the market for a consistent and integrated approach to sustainability reporting, the TNFD draft disclosures recommendations explicitly build on those already recommended by the TCFD. They follow the TCFD's 4 pillars of disclosure. That's governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And there are 15 in total under these pillars, although there are 4 new ones. So I'm not going to go through what the new ones are, but as I say, you will have these slides and all this is available on the TNFD's website. Thanks, Vic. The next slide, please. Within the TNFD guidance so far, there has been sort of biome or realm-specific guidance, drafts of which are actually going to be released on the 28th of March. But if you haven't seen this wonderful periodic table, it's actually in, I think it was the version 2 or 3 release, and that points out the how you would look at realms and then biomes and what the ecosystem services are that are developed from those realms and biomes to help you sort of think through your reporting. There are priority sectors that have been laid out by the TNFD. Those are food and beverage, renewable resources and alternative energy. I know many of you here today are from that sector. Infrastructure, extractives and mineral processing, healthcare, resource transformation, consumer goods, including apparel, and transportation. And so greater sector specific guidance on these priority sectors, as well as realm specific guidance, is going to be launched in the March 28th release. And the next slide, please. So wanted to sort of share with you the relevance of TNFD to the energy and extractives. So the TNFD focuses on developing this holistic approach to nature disclosures. So that includes an investigation not just of impacts, but also dependencies and opportunities and risks across direct operations and then also upstream and downstream in the value chain. So just a few examples here, and we'll go into a bit more detail in a moment and share with you a data resource that you might want to use. Just for example, on impacts from energy extractives, those would be on soil, air or water pollution, for example, from drilling or mining operations. I took a quick look at the renewable sector on the Encore tool that we'll share with you in a moment, and water pollution was included in that sector too. And the material importance of that is that it can be lost revenues due to perhaps reputational damage or fines or expensive restoration projects. In dependencies, there's direct physical inputs such as wood and fibres or groundwater. and that can lead to increased costs from having to further to source water or materials further afield or at a lower quality as those natural resources become depleted. In terms of opportunities, there are opportunities to implement nature-based solutions to increase the cost effectiveness of operations. That could be improved flood risk protection and ecological stability that results from, just as an example, integrated constructive wetlands, for example. And then on the risk side, obviously damage to distribution network resulting in an oil spill is just one example. The material importance of that is the disruption to business operations due to scarcity of materials and resulting in product loss. So the next couple of slides, we wanted to share with you some of the data that's come from the Encore tool. I know Vic just shared the link in the chat, I believe. So the Encore tool is a tool that a lot of people are using. You can type in your sector, you can type in your subsector, and it will list out for you what your dependencies and impacts are, and whether they are high risk or low risk. So we just wanted to share some examples with you here on nature-related impacts dependencies. This is specifically oil and gas. So as you can see, upstream, some of the impacts of water use and soil disturbance. Downstream and consumption, it might be GHG emissions. On the distribution side, it could be terrestrial ecosystems or fresh water ecosystem use that are impacted. And in terms of dependencies, upstream could be climate regulation, flood and storm protection, where the sort of the dark red of the dependencies here is in the production side, and that's groundwater and flood and storm protection, water quality. And then downstream, again, flood and storm protection on the consumption side and climate regulation. Then moving on to the metals and mining slide, we can. Thank you. So again, just an example for you, again, using this Encore tool, the illustrative impacts upstream of exploration, again, water use, soil disturbance and dependencies, less risk, very low risk, as you can see here, where the majority of the risk is the midstream on the extraction, and that's due to dependencies on groundwater, surface water, water flow maintenance, and those impacts, again, on terrestrial ecosystems and water use. As I said, we're going to share these slides with you. These are things you'll probably know better than me sharing them, what your own nature-related impacts are. But we wanted to illustrate that there are tools out there to help you begin this journey of thinking about them. One of the approaches, or the main approach that the TNFD takes into helping to help firms assess this risk is called the LEAP approach. So you might hear that term often mentioned, and it stands for locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. So the framework outlines an approach to nature-related risk and opportunity identification and also management. So first, for nature specific, you need to locate your key interfaces with nature. Then you evaluate your dependencies and impacts on nature. And then you assess what the material risk and opportunity for the organisation is based on those, and then prepare to respond and report on the TNFD recommended disclosures under the pillars that we mentioned earlier. So next slide, please. So there's a lot there, and I thought we're sort of keen to hear from those already engaging. But if you'd like to engage with the TNFD, and we really would recommend that you do, as I mentioned, Target 15 in COP15, the Global Biodiversity Framework had a commitment from over 190 countries that there will be a commitment to encourage companies to report on these nature-related risks. So we do see that it is going to be coming more and more, and there will be more pressure applied to companies globally. So we're sort of saying it's best to get in the front door, and if you've got feedback on challenges of the framework for your sector, we'd love to hear them in this window of opportunity that we have between the end of March and June. So you can engage with the TNFD by just participating in TNFD discussions. You can join the TNFD forum. There are over 900 companies globally in that forum, and that means that you'll get updates on TNFD, tailored webinars, and also you'll be pointed towards data and research that might be helpful to you. You can review and comment on the beta framework through a portal. The portal is available on the website. We'll put a link up in a moment for that. And you can also test and pilot the framework and feedback through the portal. You can get in touch with us at the following email address: TNFD-NCG, that's National Consultation Group, TNFD-NCG@gfi.green. If you have any questions or you'd like to join the National Consultation Group, you can just drop me a note and I'll let you know what that means. There's no commitment on your part other than you'll sign up to the TNFD forum, and then you'll receive all the updates from us on the different events that we're hosting to help you as you're preparing for TNFD or preparing to engage with TNFD. What we'd like to do also is host a roundtable for this sector in April or May. So you can come and, having looked through the beta framework, then provide your feedback. You'll be able to share in a safe and closed environment some of the challenges that you're having with your peers and some of the opportunities, and discuss those. So you can also just drop us a line if you'd like to register for that event. And if you signed up this webinar, you'll get the details on that anyway. So I think with that, we'd love to now invite our panelists to join us. So as mentioned, I'm joined by Mark Johnson of BP and Katie from Rio Tinto. So thank you so much for coming to be sort of the pioneers or stand in the place of pioneers for the sector. As I sort of mentioned to everyone, I just want to frame this up again. It is very early stages for every company who's looking at the TNFD. So we just want to thank you for sharing these initial learnings. They will have a Q&A after, so please do put your questions up in the Q&A app, and I'll take a look at them when we're finished with this initial conversation. So Mark, I wonder if we could start perhaps with you. You've been engaged in TNFD for a long time, before it was an informal working group. But talking about BP specifically, what's that journey been like in terms of making that move from climate towards nature, as Andrew sort of shared that is the sort of the journey people are going to be taking?
Great, thanks much, Helen. Well, first of all, thank you much, Helen, for organising this event. It's great to see so many people online and some very topical discussion going on at the moment. And first of all, broadly, you very much welcome to TNFD and what it's aiming to achieve. But I think, as you'll see from the slides, but also into discussions, it gets quite complicated quite quickly and quite technical. And so there are challenges there, but we're addressing those and we're talking through them. So in terms of our journey, it is a journey. It is an interesting one. It takes all sorts of twists and turns, if you like, in terms of part of that journey. A bit about BP and a focus on nature or biodiversity, if you like. In 2020, we sort of launched our 10 aims to get to net zero, and also revised and updated our business strategy to align with that net zero ambitions. Within less than a year later, we then launched our sustainability frame, where we had 10 aims, 5 around people and 5 around planet, and that includes ones about biodiversity, water, circularity, natural climate solutions, which very much picks up that sort of whole nature space which the TNFD is going into. And actually, as you highlighted, we were involved in the informal working group a few years ago now, and been following this very closely. And so it's been great to be involved in that whole process. So I know we're going through that journey of actually understanding what are the implications of TNFD, what does it mean for us, particularly across all the integrated energy company with such a high range of huge portfolio of activities. Now that's building on, of course, years of working in this space in biodiversity, and many of the corporates, Rio and others have as well. We've been managing our impacts on biodiversity across operations and sites for a good number of years, but now this is just one step further and understanding, particularly around the dependencies piece, and probably a bit more on the risks as well. As you'd expect, large companies like ourselves, we have processes and procedures in place already, and it's just seeing, are those picking up the dependence and risks appropriately? I'm sure they are, but just doing that part of that review and working through it. And we're doing a number of pilots around the TNFD to understand those actual issues. So it is a bit of a journey, and it's quite complicated. So that's a helicopter view.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So I just sort of highlighted some of those potential nature impacts and dependencies for the sector. Does that resonate? Were there more that you've looked at? And, is Encore a tool that you've been working with, or are there other tools?
So yeah, we used Encore, and certainly it's always tricky in terms of because of the diversity of activities we're involved in. Yes, certainly water is probably the biggest one in terms of certainly dependencies. And then it depends on how do you assess the impact? to what and to how, and how you assess that. So, and across sectors. So, for an impact in our sector may be quite significant in our sector, but compared to other sectors, it's not. So, it's quite tricky in terms of getting that relative impact associated with it. So yeah, they do. The high level ones do resonate. The Encore tour is a great initial screening tool, but I would emphasize it is just an initial screening. And I wouldn't personally, it wouldn't line up too much, but as a tool to get you started, yes, a good place to understand what those high level issues actually are. I think just an example, yes, I mean, we're an integrated energy company, so we're not just in oil and gas as an energy sector, we're also investing in carbon capture, hydrogen, EV charging. We have a big retail business. We have over 1,200 retail sites in the UK. We have a remediation management side of our business as well. So we're doing everything. We've got pipelines and infrastructure and everything else with it. So it gets complicated very quickly. And so a couple of the pilots we're looking at, for example, which you wouldn't necessarily expect for us to look at as an oil and gas company, looking at coffee, for example, because we sell a lot of coffee in our retail business. Now that as a company probably isn't material, but for the sector in the UK, it is material. So that's the sort of things we're having to look at in terms of the diversity and, if you like, the scope of the TNFD within across our business. So yeah, and EV charging and solar and other businesses which we're investing in as well. So yeah, absolutely, as a high level message, those things are captured.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting on the coffee pie. I hadn't even thought about that. Brilliant. Well, I'll come back to you in a moment on challenges and sort of tips for where to begin. But Katie, maybe if I could come to you and just hear really just the same question to start with of, where are you on this journey? How did was it like Mark, that obviously nature's been something you've been looking at for a very long time, or was it a specific shift not away from, but in addition to climate, you expanded into nature?
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Helen. And like Mark said, thank you very much for having me along. It's great to see so many people on the call and some familiar names out there, so that's great. Obviously, a similar kind of organizational complexity at Rio Tinto as we're seeing at BP as well. I mean, obviously our core products are mining, our core activities are mining, and however we do have a vast associated activity portfolio with infrastructure and agriculture and land management and our marine activities, of course. So yeah, it's incredibly broad, and likewise, like Mark said, incredibly complex in some ways. We have, as far as biodiversity and nature and climate are concerned, climate's been, as Rio is known for, climate's been a focus for quite a while. It's something we talk about, and we both internally very, very conscious of it, and also externally we publish a lot of information about our climate impacts and the way we're managing our climate, those climate impacts, and also making big strides towards investing in managing our climate impacts from a renewables perspective. Biodiversity has always been on the cards, it's always been there, and we've always been managing it through our inherent risk management processes, and through our assessment frameworks and through our internal reporting requirements as well. However, obviously there's been a big focus on it recently, and so that focus has increased our workload, I would say, to be frank. And I think everyone's probably quite familiar with that concept. So we've been doing a lot of work in a line with TNFD in the past, and obviously not intentionally in line with TNFD, but a lot of what we do internally sets us up quite nicely to disclose against TNFD. But as Mark rightly said, there are gaps, and that's a given. And for us, yes, definitely dependencies, and definitely the supply chain element of the framework as well. So likewise, Mark highlighted nicely that there are lots of questions around how we bookend the information, like how far do you go? How far up the supply chain? How far down the supply chain do you go? How in depth do you look at your infrastructure, and how do you manage the data acquisition and standardization of that information in order to disclose it? How is that being scaled up? So those are things that we're looking at the moment. We've made some really good inroads so far, as we've updated our internal risk taxonomy to align with the concept of dependency. So that's now inbuilt, so that we can start actually integrating that and pulling it out of our internal reporting requirements and reporting frameworks. Then, because a lot of, as Mark said, a lot of our sites are doing this inherently as part of their processes, but it's a matter of just pulling that information up at a level that we can then process it all together. And then we obviously disclose a lot of information about water and our water targets already, which is great. And so there's a lot of progress in that space, which can be incorporated into our TNFD work. We've undertaken also a large-scale assessment of our environmental risk associated with our suppliers. And of course, there's a lot of questions in the group about how we go about doing that in the first place, because there's always, how do you assess your risk of your suppliers if you don't understand the risk of all your suppliers? So we have looked at it at a scoping level from a spend perspective in order to do essentially that locate phase on our suppliers. And then we present this information through our board structure and how we manage our reporting and our risk through the SLT, or our senior leadership team, and our board as well. And that's thanks to TCFD and our common reporting practices that's in our external disclosures already. So, and that will just require a bit more detail and updating. So it's complex, there's work to be done, but we're also relatively comfortable with the concepts. So yeah, we're really looking forward to it. It's a great framework. And it will see us take massive leaps forward, which I'm really pleased about.
Oh, well, that's great. That's great to hear. So, I mean, I guess maybe we could talk about some of the challenges and the tips on how to start. So, Katie, maybe just starting with you, and then we'll come to Mark on challenges. What you mentioned a couple there. Are there any other sort of specific challenges you see?
Yes, yeah, no,
Okay.
No, great question. We are seeing challenges, and this has also come out of conversations that I've had with some of my colleagues at other mining companies as well. So things like, as I indicated, mapping suppliers' risk profile, where do you start? That could be, and the scale of the analysis involved is a conversation point for a lot of companies, especially companies of our size and complexity, just like BP. Because to get to a point where you are prioritizing, or you are picking a few, there is an enormous, in theory, there is an enormous amount of analysis that needs to get done, and done in a standardized and robust way to get to the point of then having that small select group to then proceed with the rest of the risk assessment framework. So that's a conversation piece that comes up. Right. Spatial data and data scaling is something that is often discussed, and we're working through internally at the moment. Is that locate phase is great, and as Mark indicated, you know, it's Encore is a fantastic scoping tool in that regard, but it's not granular enough to then bring that information down to a local site level or even a regional level. And then, of course, in order to add the robustness to your assessment, you need to be bringing in regional and local data sets. And then how do you then scale that up, ensuring that your data sources are sound enough to ensure integrity of that information? That's a conversation that comes up quite a bit. And then alignment. So obviously a lot of us are quite familiar with the Align project, but alignment between the TNFD framework, for example, GRI, AFC, and obviously a lot of those frameworks are going through updates at the moment, which is fantastic to see. And there's huge amounts of work going on to align them and bring them all together, which is great. But obviously we're all working through that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, I think also from a data perspective, the other thing that does come up is community information. So obviously, when we look at ecosystem services, we're not looking just at ecosystem services from a physical environmental perspective. And we know that the consistency of community data available across regions is quite varied. And so that is kind of a difficulty I think a lot of companies are facing. And then the other thing I have had discussions about is once we have the information about our suppliers ready to disclose, how does that play out from a commercial perspective and from a legal perspective when we actually go to disclose that information? What do we do in scenarios where, for example, I have a similar company who has similar suppliers or the same suppliers, and we're both disclosing information about the same supplier? How do we break that apart? How do we ensure that there's integrity there? And what does the assurance look like associated with that information? So those are questions that, you know, I wouldn't say are challenges, but they're things that are being discussed and working through. Offer a lot of opportunities though. So it's really good.
Yeah, that's really helpful. There is, for those watching, TNFD also has a data catalyst, that's what it's called, and it's over 100 companies who are in the data business who are looking to be able to fill in some of the gaps and sort of understand what the gaps are and that are out there. Well, coming to you then, Mark, what are the challenges as you see them? Obviously, we have a question as well, which is great.
Sure. Well, Kate has summarised it very nicely for me, so I think you've done all the work already. So no, very similar sort of challenges, I think, regardless of what sector of company you're facing. And there's some which are quite technical and others which are more sort of internal pieces as well, in terms of a couple of ones there in terms of resourcing. Kate's already highlighted that internal resource needed to do this is quite significant, and we shouldn't underestimate the resources, particularly large integrated companies like ourselves. So that is a challenge. We are actually, there's a workshop going in a moment about how do we integrate this data, because it's not just about getting the data from the site, it's about integrating into our systems and then doing also the audits and checking and accounting on those, because obviously anything we publish externally has to be independently verified. So there's that whole process which goes behind anything that data we use. So that's one side of things. Yeah, there's alignment of reporting data already highlighted, GRI, TNFD, acronym soup. We've also in the EU got this CSRD and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive coming in 2025. So there's a lot of, hopefully they're all aligned and they are linked to each other, but it does create extra, I'll say burden, but extra work on a particular company. Obviously, you have the Global Biodiversity Framework and Target 15 there as well, which is putting on emphasis on particular countries. Are we going to see different countries developing their own reporting requirements, which then adds extra work onto companies as well? Then that's the one side of it. Then I suppose the technical discussions in our house very similar, really, in terms of the scope of TNFD. I mentioned already. Are we expecting to report on our retail business, or is it just going to be the oil and gas side of things? Right. Or what's the actual scope? And then of course the usual question in terms of what do we mean by materiality? And materiality for us may be very different from a different company. A smaller company, materiality may be much more significant. So we're having a lot of questions and discussions about that materiality and where do we divide the line of what is material or not. And then there's one around obviously about data. Coach very highlighted that in terms of access data, particularly within our supply chain. We're getting hold of that data, the quality of that data, consistency in that data, because one supplier may measure it one way and a different supplier may measure it in a different way. Therefore, you've got to standardize it in terms of the units being applied. And that actually may sound relatively straightforward, but often it's not,
Mm.
because of the internal process you have to go through. Ones to watch is going to be really interesting about scenarios and how TNFD cover scenarios and sort of alignment or reporting against that. So we'll see about that one. And the other one, which we're having quite a lot of focus on at the moment, is around the SBTN also has these what call a high impact commodities, which we assume is the ones to sort of prioritize within your supply chain, and understanding not so much the operational side, but actually the strategic implications of particularly reporting against TNFD or others. So yeah, we're also looking at biofuels in a big way. We're also looking at energy transition metals, cobalt, nickel, etc. And actually, how's that actually going to change our strategy, or and this is the whole point of TNFD, really, is in terms of looking at how does nature related risks impacting your business strategy. So that's really the interesting space at the moment, which is still trying to get to grip with. But again, getting hold of that data to show and understand what those impacts and risks actually are.
Mm.
So there's a lot in there, but very similar challenges with Katie and many other companies as well going through the stage.
Are you feeding this directly back into the TNFD through the portal? What's your feedback process?
So yes, one through the portal. So registering through the portal directly, but we're also doing it through different groups. And I know lots of different associations have got their own sort of work. We're a member of the WBCSD, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. So we're feeding into that group. We've also got IPECA or gas associations also feeding through there. And actually through you mentioned at the beginning, UK Business and Biodiversity Forum, we've got a working group within that forum to basically share lessons learned between companies about how they're managing and understanding what TNFD actually means. So yes, we are. And that's really important we do that, because we always want a framework which is doable and practical.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And remember, we'll do a shout out for BBF at the end, and you can tell us where we need to go for that. There's a question here that about the speakers indicated the on-call tool, though great initial screening tool, isn't granular and therefore not really applicable enough in oil and gas and mining, given the complexity of the supply chains. Are there any other tools that you could suggest? And I don't know even if it's just sort of looking at water to begin with, for example, because I know there's maybe that's the one that's sort of I don't want to say low-hanging fruit, but the one that's maybe the path most trodden at the moment. I don't know. I guess sort of moving on to what the tips are for how you start to look at this. What would you say, Mark?
Great thing. Thinking now that way, there are a lot of tools out there, and actually what we're seeing at the moment is a huge growth in the number of tools to support businesses. Some of them will be quite expensive. There's a recent one which calls the WWF biodiversity risk tool, filter tool, which came out, which I think is a good start in terms of opportunities, again, for that high level screening. But that's one of them. Then of course there's the this is why I'm going to get my acronyms, or it's WRI, so WEF, the water management tool, which I can't remember the name of the top of my head, but my apologies for that. But that's a really good tool for basically identifying what assets you have in water stressed areas. So there are numerous different tools out there. So there are a couple of them, but they are the challenge, and Katie highlighted this. Those tools are great at a screening level, but they don't give you granularity down to the regional site specific, and that's where you're relying on either data you're collecting yourself for your site, or an environmental impact assessment, or other sort of national databases. And the UK is actually pretty good in terms of having a lot of that baseline data, but obviously many other countries are not so developed in that space. Where to start, or is this a difficult one? I think there's two things. One, in terms of just understanding where are your actual, and it may seem very simplistic, but where are your assets? And we've been talking to a few companies who are saying we don't actually have a central map of where all of our assets actually are. So that's the first point. It's just getting one place where you have all your assets in one place, in one map. So you understand that. And on top of that, if you're not also asset based, what are the main products in your supply chain which have the most significant potential impact or risk? And I would certainly refer to the SBTN high commodity frame list of high impact commodities as an initial checklist to go through. So just doing a quick screening of that and where your assets are is probably the first place. Don't worry too much, I suggest, about metrics yet. Just understanding what your general footprint is and where your activities are.
That's a great tip. Thank you, Mark. Katie, what about you? Any tools in particular that you found useful, and any tips for those just starting this journey?
Yeah, I would probably mirror what Mark said about the WRI water management tool. It's really good, and it's something that we've been using internally quite a bit already. And yeah, the WWF risk tool that recently come out is quite effective. But again, we've also been drawing on regional data sets, obviously a lot of internal data that we already have associated with approvals and our monitoring programs, and government level data where it's available. And as Mark rightly indicated, and we're all aware, different regions have access to more data than other regions. So yeah, that varies quite a bit. I think as far as getting started is concerned, my detailed brain kind of started jotting down things that I've been doing already that other people, you know, probably are doing as well. But I think I started off mapping our current disclosures against just the disclosure requirements of the framework, but also mapping our risk assessment approach and processes against the LEAP framework as well. And then from that, essentially developing a scope for what we actually have to do and have to work on. And then what I also did is establishing a working group internally, especially given the complexity of our company and the number of parts of the business that this framework will touch on. It's by no means limited to environment. So it's really important that I, you know, myself and our team had the support from the rest of the company, and that aids in the communication and the rollout when we go to actually roll out the full framework across the board. Now that's something that we're also looking at in combination of doing multiple pilots. So we're running a pilot at a development site, but also an operational site. And we're also we're mapping and drawing up a scope for the rollout of the full framework across the board as well at the moment. And yeah, engaging the sites, I think from a Rio perspective at least, having key representatives at the sites that have a lot of history with those sites and access to monitoring, baseline, approvals data is really, really key, because obviously then the communication side of the framework itself can kind of explode very quickly. So just, you know, ensuring that you've got obviously your key contacts is key. But yeah, we are going through the process. We are engaging external support as well to help with our pilots, but also to assist in rolling out the full framework as well, and making those decisions, as Mark alluded to, about what the framework actually means from an integration perspective and what the timeline of that integration is, because obviously you can disclose and then we could potentially draw our integration through with that, or you could disclose and then integrate later. You know, there's lots of strategic questions that you have to answer in relation to resourcing requirements, resourcing levels, and what is going to work best for your company as well. That's all. It will vary, of course.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. Just so we could do a bit of a wrap up now. So, and I know Lauren Weatherden at KPMG is going to join us, who's the Associate Director in Nature and Biodiversity, just to do a bit of a sort of key takeaways and talk about the sort of the FAQs or helpful resources we're going to be providing you with if you've attended today. So if you could just sort of bear with us, stay with us for a few more minutes. A quiet crowd, I'm sure everyone's munching sandwiches, but thank you for the question that we did have. It does feel important to sort of come together, particularly in sector, and share learnings and feedback. We're really keen to sort of have you do that. So we're going to be hosting something in April, May, to bring this together and capture that. It's also really helpful in helping UK government understand what's the kind of data that they might already have that it can provide. So sort of really encourage those listening to join that if you can. And Mark, please do just share with us about UKBBF. That's another really wonderful group that companies could join.
Sure, no, thank you much, Helen. So UK Business and Biodiversity Forum, it we established 18 months or so ago, and it's basically a business hub to support businesses mainstream and biodiversity, understand biodiversity and what it actually means for the business. And within that forum, we have set up a working group, TNFD working group, basically just bring business together once a month to share lessons learned around piloting or raising questions about the TNFD, and it's just a place for businesses to discuss those issues and some of the challenges we're facing. I've put the link to our website in the chat, but I think you may be able to share that externally to everybody afterwards if you're interested in that. There are other things we're involved in as well within the forum. Again, there's details on our website. I won't go into detail here. But yeah. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. And I think Vic will be able to cut and paste it out of our panelist chat. So Lauren, just over to you for some takeaways, and then we'll wrap up with just final next steps.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Helen, and hello, everyone. As Helen noted, my name is Lauren Weatherden. I'm an associate director here at KPMG, focusing on supporting businesses with integrating nature and biodiversity into their decision-making. So the team here is delighted to be supporting GFI with these sessions. And I'd like to just a quick note to thank our speakers, to Andrew for introducing the TNFD and its importance, for Katie and for Mark for sharing their experiences on the TNFD to date, and also to all of you for joining us. As Helen noted, there are kind of a few key takeaways and themes that have emerged from the discussion. The first that resonated for me was what Andrew noted about the economy being 100% dependent on nature, and also how those nature-related risks can manifest, often in quite large and very quick ways, as we've seen, but also that the opportunities are also there if we do it right. So I think with that in mind, the second key takeaway is really around the engagement with this process as being an opportunity. This is, from conversations we've had, this is very much set to frame the future of nature-related reporting, aligning closely with other frameworks and standards that you might already be familiar with. I know the acronym SOUP was mentioned, so GRI, CDP, the IFC Performance Standard 6, criteria, and SASB, among others. So again, this process is underway. I think Helen noted that the 1st of June is the deadline for integrating feedback. And it's an opportunity to understand not only what TNFD means for your sector, but also to help frame those recommendations so they're useful for you. The third is around the data. So this is something that's very close to my heart, but the challenge of data, metrics, and tools, including the monitoring across scales from the corporate level to the granular site level data required, as well as the challenge of mapping suppliers and standardizing data. So again, this is very much resonating. I think many of us are on the same path and journey on this. And it also partly illustrates the importance of starting this journey early, because it's intended to be an iterative process. This is not a get it perfect on the first go. And I think some of the work that's been done by TNFD and others, finding that there are more than 3,000 metrics, there are at least 300 global nature biodiversity data sets that I'm aware of. These do exist, and then it's finding that way of working with them so they suit you, and also then building in that level of assurance that was mentioned in terms of the accuracy, building the pipelines and the relationships with those suppliers. And then just finally on that note is around that reporting burden. I think it's a really key point that by doing this and then engaging with this, there's an opportunity, I think, as Katie was saying as well, that you can leverage data across different reporting frameworks and also build on maybe your climate-related experience as well. So again, it's hopefully less scary as you go through along the journey than it is at the beginning. And then just finally, the twists and turns that Mark noted of the journey. This is, as has been demonstrated here by Katie and Mark, it's a growing community. So there are many people you can turn to who are on this journey, who can help to share insights. It might differ for all, but hopefully that will help with things such as the community data that Katie mentioned as well. So just to close, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to those who are here or those within the TNFD network. I know that the IPECA was mentioned, WBCSD, of course, the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum that Mark just commented on. And Helen also mentioned that there will be sector-specific one-pagers and frequently asked questions that will be circulated. Hopefully that will help a little bit. And also then these roundtables that will be coming up. So please do get in touch with the UK National Consultation Group if you're interested in that process. And so with that, Helen, back to you.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you. I don't think there's anything more to be said. I think it's all been said. So just thanks all for joining us over your lunch. Thanks to our panelists, and thank you very much, Andrew. I say we'll be posting a recording. You'll be receiving the slides and a one-pager about your sector and how you can get more involved. You can email us at the email I gave earlier, or you can always email me personally. It's helen.avery@gfi.green. And we'll say we're here to help you engage with the framework and offer that feedback. So any questions, just reach out. And thank you all. Thanks. Good afternoon.